I, Maya Collins, 28, a freelance graphic designer, stitching a living together in Boston. Most days begin with the hiss of a radiator that never warms the room, and end with me retouching labels for small businesses on a laptop that wheezes like an old bus. My apartment is a converted basement in Somerville, low ceilings, a stubborn damp patch behind the bathroom door, a single window that looks at ankle-level shoes passing by on the sidewalk. My family prefers higher floors and higher standards. My parents split when I was 15. Dad, Daniel Collins, built an investment firm and a persona that never creases. He remarried Claudia, a realtor who speaks fluent square footage. My sister Rachel is the family exemplar junior partner at a big firm, good posture, faster promotions. Noah, my teenage half-brother, is the only one who texts me just to share a meme. The person who always truly saw me, though, is my grandfather Leonard Hale, a retired architect with pencil graphite in the grooves of his fingerprints. When Dad called to invite me to a birthday dinner, I hoped it's embarrassing to admit for a truce. Somewhere nice, he said, which turned out to be Maison Verne, the kind of French restaurant with velvet chairs and lighting that smooths every flaw. I spent too long choosing a black dress that would blend rather than apologize. I arrived early. Dad stood to hug me quick and performative. Claudia air-kissed without making contact. "You look polished," she said, as if I'd been recently detailed. Rachel swept in minutes later. Navy dress litigation glow, recounting a victory like it was a weather report certain, inevitable. I listened, nodding, thinking about how many nights I'd worked until dawn to meet a deadline that would never make the society pages. Noah slipped into the chair beside me, tugging at a blazer he'd clearly outgrown. "Happy birthday," Mayhe whispered. "I made you something. Later." I squeezed his hand under the table. Then Grandpa arrived tall and silver, moving carefully on the hip that's still relearning trust. He smelled faintly of cedar and drafting paper. "There's my artist," he said, grinning as he settled across from me. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled a small tin vintage charcoal pencils, the kind with soft caps that smudge like fog. Tools for when the world won't hold still. For a few minutes, we were a family performing a credible imitation of warmth. We ordered. We laughed at Noah's story about a science experiment that ballooned into chaos. My shoulders loosened. The main courses landed with quiet ceremony. Grandpa leaned forward, elbows on linen, his voice turned private. "Maya, how's the light in your place on Beacon?" he asked. "I drove by last week. Those cherry trees are outrageous this spring." My fork hovered. Beacon. I said a small echo. "I live in Somerville, the basement, remember?" The sound of metal on china snapped the air. Dad had dropped his fork. Claudia found sudden interest in her bracelet. Rachel straightened a napkin that didn't need straightening. Grandpa blinked. "The apartment," he said, slowly, surprised by his own sentence. "The one I arranged through your father. 1-bedroom brownstone near the public garden. I wanted you to have a solid base while you build your practice." Heat rose in my face, then drained away. "I've never lived on Beacon Street," I said. "I've never even had a key to anything on Beacon Street." The waiter appeared at the worst possible moment. "Everything tasting all right?" he asked, eyes flicking across a table that had forgotten how to breathe. We all murmured something that could pass for yes. He retreated like a man backing away from a cliff. Dad cleared his throat. "This isn't the place," he murmured to Grandpa, voice tight. "We can discuss logistics at home." "Logistics?" I repeated, sharper than I meant to be. "What logistics?" Grandpa's expression shifted from confusion to a careful, settled anger I'd only seen once when a contractor tried to cut corners on a ramp. "Daniel," he said quietly, "we'll finish this conversation tonight." Noah looked from face to face, lost. The table felt suddenly crowded with the things we'd never said. Outside, through the polished glass, Boston moved as if nothing had jarred. Loose cabs, wet pavement, a couple arguing gently about dessert. Dad signaled for the check. No cake, no candles. We stood a stiff procession and filed out into the chilled spring evening. As we walked toward the cars, Claudia whispered, "Let's handle this privately." It didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a lid. On the ride to my father's house in Cambridge, the city lights blurred into streaks. I watched our reflections in the window, my face pale. Grandpa's jaw set. Dad's eyes on the road, and understood that what I'd hoped would be a celebration had become an audit. By the time the colonial facade came into view, my hands had stopped shaking. Whatever waited inside, I wanted the truth to say it out loud. The Collins house in Cambridge had the stillness of a museum after hours, everything curated, nothing relaxed. Claudia ushered us into the formal living room no one actually lived in. Glass coffee table, white sofa that rejected wrinkles framed maps of Paris and Lake Como as if the walls traveled when the people didn't. I took the edge of an antique chair that squeaked under the weight of any truth. Grandpa Leonard remained standing, his hand resting lightly on the mantel, as if steadying more than himself. Dad loosened his tie, a performative gesture of informality. "Let's be calm," he said, which was code for, "Let's be careful about what gets said." Grandpa didn't sit. "Daniel," he began, voice, even in a way I recognized from old stories of clients who tried to shave inches off an ADA ramp 6 months ago, "I transferred $750,000 to your account with a letter of intent you countersigned. The purpose stated plainly was the purchase of an apartment for Maya." "Where is that apartment?" Claudia's smile was tight enough to cut paper. "Leonard, surely this isn't a tribunal. A property search takes time, and the market," Claudia, Grandpa said without looking at her. "I'm speaking to Daniel." Heat flared in Dad's cheeks. "We did discuss options," he said, "but I concluded the timing wasn't right." "Interest rates inventory." "Stop," I cut in. My voice sounded like someone else's, firmer than I felt. "You told him you bought me a place. You let him believe I had a key." Dad's gaze skittered toward the window. "I never said the transaction had closed." "That's hair-splitting," Grandpa said. He pulled an envelope from his blazer and set it on the table with a deliberate thud. "Bank record, letter of intent. Your acknowledgement that the funds were for Maya's residence." Rachel sat primly on the sofa, hands folded, the picture of composure. Only the small vertical line between her brows gave her away. "Maybe we should clarify what happened," she said, lawyer rhythm creeping in. "If there was a change of plan, there must be documentation." Dad poured himself scotch he didn't need. "The money isn't gone," he said to the room. "Not to me. I invested it." Silence is a fluid. It filled the room in a second. "You what I said. I invested it," he repeated, as if I hadn't heard his first betrayal. "You're not stable yet, Maya. Freelancing is volatile. I couldn't in good conscience put you in a Beacon Street apartment you might not manage. So I placed the funds where they could grow. They were not yours to place," Grandpa said. The evenness was gone. Steel edged his tone. "This is a misappropriation." Dad bristled. "It's stewardship. I have 25 years of experience managing assets. I protected value until Maya was someone you approve of." I asked. My palms were damp. I curled them under my legs so I wouldn't see the shine. "Until I stopped being me." Claudia leaned forward, palms out. "Let's be practical. The money is working, and when the right property, working where Grandpa asked, specifics." Dad drained the glass he'd poured for courage and walked to the bar cart to pour another. He didn't drink it. "Across several vehicles," he said. "Municipal bonds, a private equity tranche." He exhaled. "The majority is in Mark's expansion." It took a beat for the syllables to settle into meaning. "Mark," I repeated, "Rachel's Mark." Rachel's eyes flickered. "An outpatient surgical center." Dad said swiftly, trying to control the narrative the way he always had. "Ambulatory, low risk, strong return profile. It benefits the family." "The family," I said flatly, and suddenly the chair was too small for my body, the room too tight for a life. While I breathe mold and watch shoes pass my window, the family expands a clinic. "It's not about you living in mold," Dad snapped. "Composure cracking. It's about responsibility. You've treated your career like a real job," I said. "Like work that matters because it does." Rachel cleared her throat. "Maya, I didn't know it was the Beacon." "Money," she said, quieter. "Dad mentioned an investment. I assumed." "You assumed I knew," I said. "Or you didn't look too hard in case you learned something you'd have to stop." Her eyes dropped. I should have asked more questions. Noah, quiet until then, shifted in his seat. Dad told me not to say anything. He murmured the confession tumbling out. About the surprise apartment. He said it would be later. The admission landed like a small true stone. I felt its weight and its odd mercy. Noah hadn't lied to me. He'd been drafted. Grandpa picked up the envelope again and withdrew a second paper I hadn't seen before. "Rachel," he said gently, "this is not your mess to fix. Daniel, here is your signature, the date, the purpose. You knew exactly what those funds were for." Claudia stood as if height could confer authority. "This is becoming unproductive. We're all upset, the neighbors." "Which neighbors?" Grandpa asked, finally turning to her. "The ones you perform for, or the ones who might call the police when they hear a woman screaming because her father took her home away." Something brittle snapped in Claudia's face. "We will not have a scene." "But we already did. The room couldn't contain it." Dad gestured toward the hallway. "We'll talk in my office," he said. "Control to the last. This is a private family matter." "No," I said. "It's a matter of respect." Grandpa lifted a hand. "Let's move," he said calmly. And somehow we all obeyed, filing down the corridor like participants in a ritual we didn't understand. We didn't reach the office. Words outran bodies, anger outran etiquette, and the momentum carried us through the front door onto the stone steps that led to the perfectly edged lawn. The night air hit my skin like a verdict. Across the street, the Pattersons' living room glowed blue with television light. A dog barked, then stopped as if even it knew to listen. "This cannot be public," Claudia hissed. "Everyone will talk." "Let them," I said, surprising myself. "Maybe then we'll stop pretending." Dad rounded on me. "Enough. I've tried to shield you from mistakes since you were 15 and announced you were going to make a living drawing. It's a fantasy. You're 28, and what do you have to show for it?" Stickers and small business logos. The words struck in all the places I thought I'd armored. I swayed, and Noah's hand found my elbow. "Dad," he said, voice breaking, "that's not fair." Grandpa stepped between us the way he'd stepped between me and a bully on a playground once decades ago. "Daniel," he said, "you have confused control with care. You've always had that flaw, but this is a breach of trust, and it is actionable." "Actionable," Dad repeated, incredulous. "You would sue your son if he doesn't rectify a misappropriation." Grandpa's voice was quiet and deadly. "Yes." Rachel pressed her fingers to her temple as if the scene made the shape of her skull hurt. "We need to think," she said. "There are legal implications." Dad let out a sound between a scoff and a laugh. "Of course you'd say that." "Because it's true," Rachel snapped, and I recognized the razor that had made partners notice her. "There's a paper trail, Dad. A letter of intent, a transfer. You can call it stewardship. A judge will call it something else." Claudia's posture softened into something like pleading. "Daniel, return the funds. We'll find a way to unwind Mark's position. There are buyback clauses." "Not without penalty," Dad muttered. "Then pay the penalty," Grandpa said. "From your personal accounts. Not from Maya's gift." Dad's jaw clenched. "You are all ganging up on me because I made a hard call." "No," I said, finding a steadiness I hadn't expected, as if a floor had snapped into place under my feet. "We're asking you to do the honest thing." An ambulance siren dopplered past 2 blocks away. Someone's emergency, someone else's business. Our business was here. Grandpa turned to me, his lines softened by the porch light. "Maya," he said, "I can recover this. I hoped tonight would end with cake. It will end with signatures instead. But I need you to know something while we're naming truths." He took a breath I felt in my own ribs. "The scholarship that carried you through your last 2 years at Mass Art, the Alder Fellowship, that was my money channeled through the Alumni Foundation. I wanted to support you without feeding your father's narrative that you were dependent. And the first internship you landed at Blue Harbor Studio, I asked the creative director to pay attention to your portfolio. He did. You earned the spot." But I nudged the door. The porch light hummed. The dog across the street barked again twice, then went quiet. I stared at my grandfather. "The people who raised you give you their stories. Sometimes they forget to give you the full text, so I didn't get there on my own," I said, almost lightly, as if trying on a sweater. I wasn't sure fit. My smile tasted like metal. "That's the footnote." "No," Grandpa said immediately. "You got there on talent and work. I made sure your path wasn't erased before anyone could see it. The ground shifted anyway. I had carried certain memories like talismans, acceptance letters, proof I belonged. A business card from Blue Harbor I once kept in my wallet like a promise. Now they flickered in a strange new light, still precious but changed. Dad seized on the confession like a rope thrown to a drowning man. You see, he said to the night to the neighbors, to the God he believed in only when it benefited him. This is what I mean by protection. Leonard has been interfering for years. You haven't actually stood alone, and you use that as permission to steal, I said. Because you like the story where I needed guarding more than the one where I made choices. Claudia put a hand to her throat. Steal is a strong word. Then use your word, I said. Borrow, divert. Repurpose. Pick the verb that helps you sleep. Noah shifted beneath my elbow. He whispered, and I realized my body was trembling. I let the tremor happen. It belonged to me. Rachel looked at Grandpa. If we unwind, can you return the full amount to Maya? She asked. Professional now. Not in a trust, not in a structure. In her name. Yes, Grandpa said, in her name, no conditions. Something in my chest cracked that wasn't a breaking exactly. A pressure release valve, maybe. Air returned to corners I'd forgotten to breathe into. Dad sagged, suddenly older. When the empire you build turns out to be made of your preferences instead of principles, gravity changes. I'll make it right, he said hoarsely. Leonard draft the documents. Claudia call Mark. Rachel find the least punitive exit. We're not your staff, Rachel said, but she was gentler now. We're your family. The word felt temporary. I can't be here, I said softly. Not for the rest of this part. I looked at Grandpa. Thank you for the truth. I wish I'd had it earlier. I don't know what I'll do with it yet. He nodded, eyes glassy. I'm sorry for my part in the half-truths. Dad took a step toward me, cowed, contrite, grasping. Maya. I lifted a hand. No more speeches tonight. I turned and walked down the steps, my heels sounding too loud on stone. The lawn was a green I wanted to ruin with a tire track. The streetlights washed the sidewalk in a color that always felt like wrong daylight. I didn't have a plan for where to go. A way was enough. I was halfway to the corner when feet pounded behind me. Maya, wait, Noah. He reached me, breathless blazer too short at the wrists, a teenager dressed in the idea of adulthood. He held out a small paper bag folded twice at the top. I was going to give it to you at the restaurant, but then... Everything. Inside was a bracelet. Braidwork and teal and moss, the colors of a painting I'd done for his room when he was 10 Ocean Meeting Field, an impossible horizon where both could be true. The knot was clumsy and perfect. I know it's dumb, he said. But I thought you could keep it when things suck. It's not dumb. I said, my voice finding the soft register it kept for him. I slid the bracelet onto my wrist. It was a tad small and sat high against my pulse point like a reminder. It's exactly right. He swallowed. Are you done with all of us? He asked, eyes bright with a question bigger than a family should make a boy ask. Not with you, I said. Never with you. He glanced back at the house at the silhouettes moving behind gauzy curtains. They're going to fight all night, he said. I know. Will you text me when you get home? Yes. He nodded. Then did something he hadn't done since he was 9. He wrapped his arms around me in a fast, fierce hug, and then let go before either of us could name it. I'm sorry, he said. You didn't do this, I said. As he trotted back, I heard the front door open. And again voices skittering down the steps, Dad's insistence, Claudia's damage control, Grandpa's low commands, Rachel's lists. I didn't turn. I walked the bracelet tight against my skin. On Brattle Street, the wind slid between houses like a rumor. Cars idled at a light. A cyclist clipped past headlamp, carving a ribbon on the asphalt. I pulled out my phone and stared at my screen. 12 missed calls stacked like blocks I had no desire to build with. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The city had its own pulse at night, different from day, less aspirational, more honest. Window by window, the versions of lives people displayed went dark, leaving whatever remained when no one was watching. I thought about the life my father displayed, and the one he lived, about the love my grandfather offered, and the strings he threaded through it, about the version of me each of them held the cautionary tale, the protege, and about the version I was still assembling with my own hands. By the time I reached the corner where the bus hissed and kneeled for boarding, my shaking had subsided. What replaced it wasn't calm, not yet, but clarity's scaffolding. At the top of the street, the colonial facade disappeared behind trees. I didn't look back. Some stories require a chapter break. You can feel in your bones. I pressed the bracelet to my wrist, felt the small knot like a heartbeat, and headed toward the life I would have to draft without anyone else's pencil. For a week after the fight on the Collins front steps, My days moved like I was wading through honey. I slept in odd shifts, worked in shorter ones, answered only Noah's texts. You okay? Eat something that isn't coffee, and ignored the chorus of missed calls from everyone else. I cleaned the damp strip behind my bathroom with vinegar and baking soda, as if scrubbing could make the whole story less mildewed. It didn't. On the 8th morning, someone knocked a bright, assertive rap that belonged to a person who baked before sunrise. I cracked the door to find a woman in a flour-dusted hoodie holding a paper box tied with twine. Hi, I'm Hannah. I just moved into 1B, the light-blessed one, directly above your subterranean grotto. She grinned. I brought peace offerings. Cardamom knots. Cardamom knots, I repeated because the words were a raft. They fix approximately 3 problems, she said. 4 if you add coffee. I let her in. She looked around my Somerville cave without flinching and set the box on my tiny table like it deserved linen. We ate in the kind of quiet that makes room for names. She was a pastry chef at a cafe on Cambridge Street, working her way up to head baker. She mentioned morning prep starting at 4, and then with the same breeziness she'd offered bread asked, "So who do I need to glare at?" "Family," I said, "the unfixable kind." And then I told her, not every word, not the old scars, but the relevant bruise, the birthday dinner, the Beacon Street phantom, the $750,000 turned into someone else's opportunity, the porch fight that made neighbors mute their televisions. I surprised myself by crying only once. When I finished, Hannah topped off my mug with coffee she'd smuggled in a thermos. "That's not unfixable," she said. "It's devastating and infuriating and expensive, but not unfixable. Step 1 oxygen mask on you. You need work that reminds you you're not the version of yourself they narrate. I have clients," I said, defensive as a reflex. "Label design menus, occasional brand refreshes. I make rent." "I'm not doubting. I'm offering something," she said. "The cafe owner wants to do something with the back wall murals or having a moment. If you're interested, give me a sketch." No nepotism, just proximity. Proximity. Doorways. How much of my life had depended on who stood near me with a key? "I'll sketch tonight," I said. I did. I filled a pad with coffee plants and Harvest Hands beans, turning from pale green to oily rich steam that curled into topographical maps of Boston. In the morning, Hannah carried the pad to work like we were smuggling gold. By noon, she texted, "He loves it. Can you come by at 3 to talk materials and timeline?" The cafe Anchor and Beans smelled like comfort and ambition. The owner, Louise, was a former architect who'd fallen in love with pastry case geometry. "I want a wall you can drink," he said, running a hand along the blank plaster, "something that makes people taste with their eyes." I walked him through a plan base coats projection grid layers of acrylic where I'd push depth, how I'd guard against humidity creep from the neighboring dish pit. He nodded the way Grandpa nods when a plan respects gravity. We shook on a fair rate. It wouldn't make anyone rich. It would make me honest with myself. I started the next morning at 7. Hannah taped a wet paint butt like on purpose sign to a chair and slid me a croissant without asking if I'd eaten. I blocked in broad swaths of forest greens and bronze browns, then carved leaves and cherries out of negative space. By midday, my hands had steadied into the old ritual load touch lift, and my brain had dialed to a frequency where the city's noise was texture, not interference. People watched. A pair of undergrads argued about whether the cherries read as cherries or as concept. A dad lifted his toddler elbow high so she could see the steamy curl that had become the Charles River. Louise stood at intervals watching with the intent of a man measuring a beam and the softness of a man falling in love. That evening, as I cleaned my brushes in the cafe's tiny back sink, I checked my phone. 12 missed calls had become 19. One new message was from an unknown number. "Ms. Collins, this is Benjamin Reed, counsel for Mr. Hale. Please contact when convenient." 2 more voicemail transcriptions were Grandpa's voice asking me to call. A text from Noah. "They're in crisis mode. Also, your mural is kind of everywhere. Someone posted a time-lapse. Go look before you pretend you're above it." I wasn't above it. The video had 5,000 views, a montage of brush wall. Brush wall people's heads tilting. Comments like this slaps, and weirdly thirsty for a cappuccino now. I laughed alone in a back hallway that smelled like bleach and cinnamon, and allowed myself 15 seconds of uncomplicated joy. Then I called Grandpa. He picked up on the first ring. Maya. The voice was rough with age and emotion. I've retained counsel. Your father understands the situation. We're unwinding. I would like to see you somewhere neutral, not a house. Tomorrow, Boston Public Garden by the Swan Boats. Okay, I said, because there are sentences that sit at the hinge of before and after. Tomorrow. The public garden in spring looks fake even in person. Tulips behave like a synchronized swim team. The trees have memorized their shade. The water holds its breath. Grandpa was on a bench facing the footbridge posture straight in the way that has always meant he's bracing against something he won't name. He stood when I approached, then sat because dignity isn't stupid. You look tired, he said. You look like you didn't sleep, I said. We smiled without a joke between us. He reached into his blazer and brought out a thin white envelope. It's not a trick, he said, because he knows I watch for them now. A new account in your name only. $750,000. Liquid. No trust, no schedule, no co-signers. Your father has executed a repayment agreement from his personal assets. There will be penalties and consequences on his end. None will be yours to carry. I didn't take the envelope. I don't know if I want it, I said. The word surprised me by existing in the air. I suspected, he said. I brought it anyway, not to fix you, to fix the math. Why does help feel like a rigged game, I asked. Why does independence feel allergic to love? When I was your age, he said, and I almost laughed at the cliché, until his voice thinned. I turned down a partnership that would have made my life easier because I wanted to be the kind of man who didn't need it. I ended up being the kind of man who resented everyone who offered what I didn't take. Your grandmother. God, she was clear-eyed, told me. Help without strings is a tool, and the story we tell about it is the string. Accepting a hammer doesn't mean you didn't design the house. I don't know if I trust myself to hold it, I said. You trust yourself to hold a brush, he said. Same muscles, different weight. We sat quietly watching a couple guide a boat, like they'd practiced not fighting. Finally, I took the envelope. It felt as light as a bill, which is to say heavier than it should. I did something else wrong, he said suddenly, as if confession had a momentum of its own. The scholarship, the internship. I told you bits last night, but not the part where I convinced myself secrecy was virtue. I was afraid that if you knew you'd feel small. I didn't consider that hiding help shrinks it into shame. I'm sorry. I'm angry, I said. At you, at him, at the version of me in both of your heads who needed managing. You get to be, he said, and I get to keep telling you you're more than the version any of us held. That's my penance. That, and showing up with lawyers when necessary. We both laughed, which wasn't forgiveness but wasn't not. As we stood to leave, he touched the envelope in my hand. Use it or don't, he said. But don't let it rot because you're proving something to people who already aren't listening. Back at Anchor and Bean, I climbed the stepladder into the grid of my own making. The mural needed mid-tones and a bolder line along the leaf veins. I added a small woman's hand cupping a cherry cluster, the knuckles smudged with soil, the fingernails bitten to soft crescents. Someone asked in the comments later if it was mine. I said yes. The second week of the project, Rachel walked in. I spotted her reflection first, a navy ghost in the pastry case glass, then the real thing. Hair pulled back without the usual blowout sneakers instead of heels. She stood near the door like a person who respected emergency exits and asked, "Can we talk?" Hannah assessed the room with bartender wisdom and wiped the counter like a stagehand manufacturing privacy. I climbed down, wiped my palms on a rag, and nodded at a corner table. I left the firm, Rachel said before hello, 2 weeks ago. I kept waiting to feel reckless. I mostly feel honest. There's a community music center in Dorchester that needs an administrator who can also teach piano. I'm interviewing. I blinked. Piano, I said, remembering a girl perched on a bench in our childhood living room, Bach etched into her jaw. I sold the bench to pay for the blazer, she said wryly. I can buy a new bench, Markway asked carefully. Is furious, she said, but that was already true for other reasons. She stared at the mural a long time. You're good, she said finally. Not like a sister compliment, like a person who has seen a lot of good enough and knows when it isn't this. I wanted to give her a sarcastic quip to keep the ground safe. Instead, I said thank you. I'm sorry, she added, for not asking more questions when Dad said investment, for liking the story where you were stubborn and therefore somehow deserved the struggle. I think I needed you to be that to excuse the parts of me I was neglecting. We let the sentence sit. The espresso machine hissed like applause. Outside, a bus lumbered by with an advertisement for a private hospital that made recovery look like a spa day. Mark's clinic had a similar poster. I stared at the smiling model and felt something like pity for an idea that had eaten so much else. "Dad is unraveling," Rachel said. "Claudia is insisting on a narrative where everyone wins. Grandpa has turned into a polite buzzsaw. Noah stays at friends' houses. I keep waiting for the moment where someone calls me a traitor, and we're all relieved to have the label. It hasn't happened yet. It's not going to be one moment," I said. "It's going to be a bunch of boring ones with paperwork, and the occasional dramatic one with yelling." "Are we okay?" she asked. "You and me." "I don't know," I said, choosing the kind of truth that tastes like tap water instead of wine. "But we're not okay. We're in draft." She nodded like a lawyer who sees a clause she can negotiate. "Draft is better than fiction," she said. Fiction was killing me. After she left, Hannah slid me a cookie and a look. "Sister," she asked. "Sister," I said. 2 days later, Noah emailed from his school account because he's an old soul who thinks of paper trails. Dad and Mark had a blow-up in the driveway. Grandpa was there. It was almost funny if it hadn't been terrible. Also, your mural got written up by a local blog. I'm sending it to you before you pretend you're above that too. The blog post called The Wall a warm geography of caffeine and care. The comments devolved into a debate about whether murals count as gentrification or resistance. The only part that mattered to me was the photo where my hand hovered over the cherry branch like a promise. That night, after close, I pulled out the envelope from Grandpa and sat with it at a corner table. Luis turned chairs upside down on tables. Hannah wrapped tomorrow's dough. The cafe hummed with the gentle industry that makes a city survive itself. I slid the bank statement out and looked at the numbers. They didn't make me giddy. They made me literate, like I could read a thing and decide what it meant instead of having it interpreted for me. I put the paper back and texted Grandpa I took the account. "No decisions yet. Thank you for making it mine." "Of course," he wrote. "It always was." At 9 the next morning, while I was laying in a thin glaze wash to unify the midtones, a text came from an unsaved number I knew anyway. I heard about the mural. "May I see it?" The punctuation was careful, which is to say my father was trying not to trip wires. I stared at the question. I thought of the night on the steps of the years of being told success had a shape that looked nothing like me. I thought of the hand in the mural, and my own wrist wrapped in Noah's bracelet. Then I typed tomorrow at 10. "Anchor and Bean. I'll be working. If you come, be quiet and watch first." There was a long pause, long enough to imagine him drafting and redrafting, asking Claudia for PR spin, and then rejecting it, asking himself who he was if he didn't have a script. Finally, I will be there. The next morning, I arrived early to do the kind of prep that looks like staring. Light pools differently at 10. The steam line in the painted cappuccino needed a little more spine to lead a viewer's eye into the plantation hillside. I adjusted the grid with a chalk line taped fresh edges put on the playlist I use when I don't want to think about lyrics. Hannah dropped a cappuccino beside my ladder without comment. "Your 10 o'clock will either change everything or nothing," she said. "Both outcomes require hydration." At 9:58, the bell over the door chimed, and a couple slipped in shoulders touching. At 9:59, a delivery guy with a stack of milk crates. At exactly 10:00, the door opened again. I didn't turn. I placed the brush against the wall, drew a long, clean stroke through the steam curl, and felt the air behind me change the way rooms shift when a new gravity steps in. "Good morning," I said to the paint, and let the next silence be his. He stood behind me for a full minute before saying anything. I kept painting a thin sweep through the steam curl, a firmer edge along a leaf vein. The wall breathed. The cafe murmured. When his voice finally came, it was quieter than I remembered. "How do you make the steam look like it's moving?" he asked, when it isn't. "Direction," I said, not turning yet. "And restraint. If you overwork it, it dies." He let out a breath that could have been a laugh. "I know something about overworking things." I climbed down the ladder and faced him. Daniel Collins' off-brand in jeans and a soft shirt, no tie to tighten, no script to stand on. He looked at the mural as if it were a chart he didn't know how to read. "I came to see what I dismissed," he said. "And to say I'm sorry before I say anything else." Hannah slid a cappuccino onto the nearest table and vanished like a stagehand. A few customers watched us the way people watch the weather. "I don't want a courtroom apology," I said. "No, if I hurt you, I need plain language." "I stole your agency," he said, and the word stole made Claudia flinch in my imagination. He kept going. "I convinced myself control was protection. I was wrong. I am trying to unwind what can be unwound, and I won't touch what's yours again unless you ask." The room didn't applaud, and neither did I. But something unclenched. "Boundaries," I said, taking them off with paint-streaked fingers. "No unsolicited advice about my work or my money. If you want to understand something, you ask. You don't reroute it. You show up when invited, and when you're here, you look." He nodded, as if each sentence pinned something to a wall inside him. Agreed. He studied the painted hillside. "What happens next with this?" He meant the wall, but not only. "I glaze the midtones, sharpen the cherry sign small," I said. "Then I start the next wall, and I look for a space with real light." "A studio," he said, like a person sounding out a word in a new language. "A studio," I said, "not Beacon, mine." We were quiet long enough to hear the milk steam and the register drawer ring. He reached for a rag and awkwardly for my brush bin. "May I help you clean up?" he asked. "Sure," I said, because humility deserves a task. We worked side by side at the tiny sink the way people do when big things are too fragile to touch directly. He didn't tell me how to do it faster. I didn't tell him how to repent better. It was enough. As he was leaving, he paused by the doorway. "Your grandfather says help without strings is a tool," he said. "I haven't earned the right to hand you any tools, but if you ever ask me to carry something heavy from one end of a room to the other, I will." "Noted," I said. He touched the brim of no hat and went. 6 months later, I turned the key in the door of a converted loft in Somerville and remembered the basement as if it had happened to someone I cared about but didn't have to be anymore. High ceilings, real windows, concrete floors that took paint like they expected to be marked. I used part of the money to buy it outright. The rest sits where it can breathe my decision, my risk tolerance, my call. Work multiplied in the small Goodway restaurants, a school hallway, a community center, gym, where the wall swallowed color and gave it back brighter. I hired 2 assistants, Leah, who can draw hands like she's met every one of them, and Tomas, who knows ladders and patience. On Saturdays, Noah shows up with a sketchbook and pretends he isn't proud when I say a line is honest. Sometimes Rachel comes after her morning classes at the Arts Center, chalk dust on her fingers, relief in her posture. She plays piano for the kids between forms and invoices. She is for the first time since we were little recognizably herself. Leonard visits with a tin of charcoals and stories he finally tells without the part where he's the quiet hero. He sits at my big table and draws shadows that make objects stand up straighter. Once he apologized again for the secret scaffolding he built under my early steps. I told him I was done holding gratitude and anger like they were mutually exclusive. "We can name both. We can live with both." He smiled in the way that means his chest is lighter. "My father practices. That's the right verb. He practices showing up without rearranging the furniture. He stands at openings and asks other painters how they solved a corner. He brings coffee and no opinions. He forgets sometimes and begins a sentence with, 'You should,' then stops and says, 'What do you think?' The first time he did it, we both noticed. The 5th time, only I did. In October, we hung string lights across the studio and pushed work tables against the wall. Hannah baked a cake that looked like palette knives had loved it. Louise brought a bag of beans that smelled like a mountain morning. We called it a small celebration for a large mural at the Children's Hospital. People came, artists, baristas, a few nurses in scrubs, my brother, my sister, my grandfather, my father. Claudia sent flowers with a card that said congratulations in a font that tried too hard. I put them on a windowsill where the light was kind. There were conversations I didn't have, and ones I finally did. Rachel told Leonard she'd kept the scholarship news from herself because she'd needed a story where she'd earned every inch. He said earning isn't the only currency. Sometimes the price is telling the truth. Noah showed Dad a page of gestures, and Dad said I like this one, and Noah said me too, and no one explained why either opinion mattered. Luis asked my father whether creative work scales. My father said, "Sometimes you scale the business so the work doesn't have to," and I watched the sentence surprise him with its own reasonableness. Near the end of the night, After the cake had become crumbs and the lights had softened into a glow, Dad helped me stack chairs. He didn't make it ceremonial, he just did it. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, and then added the clause that made it real. "Not because this is successful, though it is, but because it's yours." I touched the bracelet on my wrist. Noah's braid a little frayed now, the knot sitting high like a friendly reminder. I had moved it to my drawing hand months ago, not for luck, just for company. When everyone had gone, Leonard lingered eyes on the big wall where tomorrow's grid would start. "You know, he said some seams are stronger than the original fabric." "I know," I said, "but I still prefer clean edges when I can get them. Fair." He kissed my temple and left me with the quiet. I stood by the window and looked out at the lights stitched across the neighborhood. The old basement was 2 streets over and a world away. The Beacon apartment had never been mine. This loft is. Not because a number in a bank account made it possible, though, that mattered, but because I chose it, and I will choose it again tomorrow when I unlock the door and pick up a brush. The story doesn't end with everyone fixed. Mark still glares at me in the grocery store. Claudia still curates her life like a listing. My father still reaches for a steering wheel that isn't there. But we are driving different cars now. He sits in the passenger seat when invited. He watches the road I'm on and lets me keep my hands on it. Before I turn out the lights, I sign a small sketch tacked to the cork wall. Steam, a hillside, a woman's hand, a thin line that says yes instead of please. I lock up the bracelet snug against my pulse and pocket the key. Not a key someone pressed into my palm with conditions. A key I cut. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time, as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.